Hi, I'm Austin Wintory, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Today I am talking with a composer duo who operate as a pair named Kaveh Cohen and Michael Nielsen, who have a fascinating and amazing story working together, sort of conquering the world of advertising and trailers under the collective moniker of Ninja Tracks, and also getting increasingly busy in the world of games. They've recently come out with Forza Motorsport. They've done multiple of the Forza franchise. They got their career started by doing Splinter Cell Conviction, and they have just an absolutely incredible story of meeting at Guitar Center and then making their way up in the world, building a world-class mixing facility, and being two just generally lovable and wholesome and wonderful guys working together. And so I had a great time talking to them. I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much.
Play it on Xbox.
All right, Kaveh and Michael, collectively Ninja Tracks, both as names and as the collective entity. How you both doing today?
I'm great.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks,
Rob.
It's good
Likewise. Yeah, it's. I was going to say the same. You beat me to the punch. It's nice to finally meet you, having heard about your partnership years and years ago, and as subtext to our potentially confused listeners, as I repeatedly prostrate myself in apology to Kaveh on our many years overdue lunch. It's just as informed subtext as I try to make up for it by hopefully making this fun for both of you.
You are forgiven. You are forgiven.
Oh, don't let me off that easy. Like an hour from now, let make me earn it.
All is clear.
Yes, Kaveh has only said mostly nice things about you.
Except the lunch.
Other than the lunch thing. Yeah.
Other than the lunch.
I remember, I don't know if I can pinpoint precisely when we first met, but I think it revolved around Eric Whitaker's Disney Hall.
That's it. Yeah.
What was the name of that piece? It was like a big, almost like a mass, like a big full-length quasi-theater piece that he wrote. I'm blanking on the name of it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and I worked on it a little bit on the stage version with him. I can't remember what it's called, but yeah, that. Okay, so I
am remembering correctly that it was sort of like it was like in the lobby at Disney Hall or something. It was, I think, our first time ever meeting.
That is exactly right.
That was probably 10 years ago, give or take, a good healthy time ago.
Yeah.
And in stark contrast, here and now, meeting Michael. There are very few composer partnerships, and that of the few out there that I've had the chance to speak with, folks like Andy Grush, half of the Newton brothers, and a handful of others. And I'm always endlessly fascinated, especially those that really manage to make it work more than just a one-off. You two have a real kind of enduring collaboration. So can you just step me through how your paths initially actually, you know what, I'm gonna do a little more due diligence about this. Why don't you each give me just the kind of quick and dirty on what led you to that moment of initially meeting, just like how you discovered music as a kid, and also to what extent games were on your radar during that time. And then the story will culminate in how you two met 20 something odd years ago and started working together. Mike, so whichever one of you, okay, yeah.
Mike's going to go first.
I was at UCLA studying history and wanting to be the greatest heavy metal guitar player that has ever lived, which didn't work out
as a history major.
Yes. Well, you got to go back into the medieval times, into the dark ages and stuff.
I see.
That's where you really get the good stuff.
Sort of Zeppelin inspired guitarist.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. When I was there, I met great composer Brian Tyler. So we were fast friends there. And so he had the single-minded vision of like, I'm going to be a composer. And I was like, you can't just do that. You have to go to some
history major
or
first.
Something like that. Yeah. You got to learn all about the Dark Ages. When we sort of split our ways, I was like, this little gem or germ was kind of seated there of like, well, that's a pretty cool thing. But I wanted to get into pop music production, rock music production, be in bands and stuff like that. So over the course of that, of doing that and needing to make some extra money too, I decided to get a job at Guitar Center. And as luck would have it, in this little slice of time when I was at Guitar Center, this very dashing man across from my Zoom camera here was also there. And just we hit it off right away. I mean, he had the perfect level of sarcasm and intelligence and humor and all that stuff. That was just like,
you were
this
both
guy's great.
Employees, meaning, or Kaveh, you came in as a customer?
No, we fortuitously ended up as employees in our early 20s, like right after school. As Michael said, like everyone needs a job after school. So we ended up there with actually a couple other folks that we're still friends with to this day that went on to also create careers in music. But we were all working behind the keyboard counter together at that time.
That's so funny. I don't think I've ever heard that. That's what a wonderful selling point for getting a job at Guitar Center after school.
Well, back then it was much better than it is today. I think now it's just terrible when we walk in there. But back then, like, people were like really knowledgeable and they knew gear, and it was just a much more like curated process. But anyway, Mike, sorry.
Well, plus the other upside was that software companies would come in and be like, let me introduce you to this thing called Cubase. And they'd be like, swing by the shop, and you'd walk out with a box of boxes, like 15 boxes. And then the dongle, I don't know if you remember dongles, where they'd be like a serial dongle that you have to plug in, much like an iLock, except the dongle is this big on the back of your computer for each software. So the dongle would plug into the dongle, and you'd have this like subway 2 feet.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, that was another upside, is like tons of free software. There's so much technology happening then. Giga Sampler, the Kurzweil stuff. It was just blowing the Korg Tritons, and it was really an exciting time for music technology. I think that was like after that new wave stuff, when DX7s and stuff was coming out. This was sort of the next generation of like this boom.
Spectrasonics of the world.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my
Absolutely.
God, Kaveh and I, we would go to NAMM, and we would drive back from NAMM listening to the Spectrasonics demos on CD. Like, it was so music nerdy. Yeah, it was just like, look, check out these drums, check out these pads. It was great. But that's why we hit it off, because we were just like so into the tech and the nerdiness and stuff. And I think more for me, Kaveh was deep into this idea of film scores and in the landscape. And for me, that was like, oh, this is kind of a second look at it. And he brought so much to the table of like, this is amazing. Check this out. It was a real kind of just like osmosis education there of like just enjoying it because he enjoyed it so much and was like, this is super cool. And then, at one point we were just like, we should try something together.
Yeah.
How long a time? I'll follow your lead and we'll jump to your bit of this question, Kaveh. But out of curiosity, from that meeting at Guitar Center to going, what if we, threw our hat in on a gig together or whatever? However that first kind of manifested. What time frame is that? Like, how quickly did you kind of jump on this, or was this did several years just go by in the last few sentences of your story?
There was a couple of things that had come up, like small projects, and we had like a passion project that was completely unrelated to film music. That was, I think, probably one of the first larger collaborations that we had that involved another friend as well. And then shortly after that, now this is all late 90s. I think we probably met in 1990, I want to say 7, something like that.
Yeah.
And so we had done a few things here and there. And around 1999, there was the first like television job that had come in for a show called Hollywood Off Ramp.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was one of the very, very first media related things that we collaborated on. I know Michael after that he had started a production company and he was doing a lot of songwriting, producing and things like that, engineering. And this is right when we left Guitar Center, which I think was about 1999. And I segued into scoring a lot of documentaries and sort of animated shows. I was ghostwriting a lot at that time. But we fell into doing music for film advertising, TV advertising, things like that through another friend also at the Guitar Center. And his is an interesting story because he took a class at UCLA that was gifted to him by a guy who was a sort of a stalwart in the industry by the name of Robert Etall. And he was teaching a class on trailer music and things like that. And Paul took it, came to us and said, hey, this is really interesting. We should try to do something. And so we all got our feet wet around 2000 or 2001. And Michael and I had success doing this individually. And by 2004, we said, hey, look, this is something. Let's get together, start a company. And Ninja Tracks was born in 2004.
And just for the sake of, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, I think partly because one of the reasons it works is maybe like a marriage, maybe not, is that we were so young and sort of had nothing to lose at the time. So we had just everything to gain at that time. And then when we started really working together, where it was like a true partnership of like, okay, here we go. My name is signed to your stuff. Your name is signed to my stuff. There was a long journey of like, okay, well, I have to be comfortable with the stuff you're doing and you have to be comfortable with stuff I'm doing. And there was a massive amount of, I think, learning each other and self-learning and of saying like, okay, I'm great at this, but like, okay, I have a long way to go for this other stuff. And just being open to take that journey. But it helps, I think, maybe that you were younger, because if we started today, it'd be like, forget it. Take a nap.
Yeah, that's what's always interesting is invariably people develop individual personalities, and creating art, no matter what its function, a 20-second ad spot or a 4-hour game score, it requires a certain amount of lowering your guard and putting it out there. And it's hard enough to do with a director on the other side, but then to have to triangulate that with someone else. I've always just been fascinated by people who make that work and obviously do so at a great, high level and successfully. For the sake of not glossing over it, Kaveh, just zooming back to your road to Guitar Center, because it's fascinating that it feels like, you had the sort of career path ambition earlier and sort of steered the partnership that way, based on what you've said so far. So what clued you in onto that, ahead of schedule, as it were?
Yeah. So I grew up in England. And I started, like most kids do, just taking piano lessons, things like that. But I had discovered composition and my ability to sort of write my own little nuggets, so to speak, at a very young age. And it was around that same time, growing up in England, there's a lot of synth pop. So there's, Depeche Mode and Erasure and Pet Shop Boys and like all this stuff. So right around the time I was really kind of discovering what composition is, I was getting into synth pop and learning a lot about the electronic sides of things, which were very much in their infancy at the time. You know what I mean? We're talking in the early 80s.
Yeah.
But these two things sort of intersected at the same time. And the first big, what I would call like aha moment for me was seeing E.T., which was 1982. And
it's very funny to say synth pop. My aha moment was E.T. That feels like some kind of pun that you're playing with there. But
the synth pop thing, I think, really.
What was your Duran Duran moment? Sorry.
Oh, right, exactly. No, I think it's the synth thing I mentioned because of, as Michael mentioned, there's a deep love of technology and electronics, synths, plugins, all that kind of stuff. And I think that seed was planted early on by what I was listening to. But as far as like the love of film music and things like that, it was Williams' E.T. score. And it was the first piece of music my parents bought me. It was on a 7-inch vinyl that I still have in the studio all these years later. We had this turntable in our family room, and I'd go sit in front of it and listen to this thing. And, I don't know what I'm listening to. I was just unbelievable. And then seeing it to picture and just so moving. But that sort of really planted the seed where I'm like, this music and this combination is just magic. And I want to know more. I want to learn more. I want to listen more, and so on and so forth. And so, I'd have a little tape recorder and I'd sit in front of the TV when the Knight Rider theme would come on, and I'd record that, or the Airwolf theme would come on and I'd record that. And so, again, it's like that intersection between electronics, because those were all so synth driven, and the fact that they're thematic, they're television music, things like that. So there was a lot of that early on for me. And it grew into me having a small setup, electronic setup, and composing more and just kind of sticking with it until we decided to move to the States, which was now the very late 80s. So I came here, stuck with it through high school, had a setup at home, my R8 drum machine and my K2000 and, whatever, I can't remember what it was at the time. But and then I just kind of stuck with it. I started collecting film music, which is something that I'm very, very eager and involved to this day. I'm still buying stuff on CD. I'm one of the few. So
I'm right there with you. It's like a vice at this point, but yeah, I'm right there with you.
It just sounds better. And there's something, I miss those days of like going to the store and like flipping through hundreds of CDs and wasting 3 hours of my life.
My single favorite was back before sort of the pervasiveness of people just ripping things and putting them on YouTube or on file share kind of stuff. It was like 15, 20 years ago. I would keep track of the secondary collector's market, and one of the most valuable CDs was the long out of print, never to be printed again, John Williams score to The Witches of Eastwick, which you could easily buy for like $200.
Right.
And I was at an Amoeba-esque secondary CD store, but because they don't know anything about soundtracks, they saw it as some old record no one cares about. They had it for like $5, and it was the greatest moment of my life to find that CD, totally. Beautiful condition at what is basically generic retail price, knowing that, I didn't have it. So I wasn't going to resell it, but I was like, I could resell this for like a 10,000% profit. Right. And so we're cut from a similar cloth for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then, again, as I mentioned, that's just that love of film scores and collecting. And I generally listen to film music most of the time. Most days, in the car, you generally won't find anything else. So it's been a lifelong love for me. But it started then. And like, as Michael said earlier, like once we arrived at the Guitar Center, the Guitar Center in itself was a huge catalyst to want to go and do something else, because you're like, I don't want to be here.
Instantly.
How the hell?
You don't want to listen to Stairway to Heaven over in the electric guitar section of the store every day over and over and over.
Exactly. I mean, especially the guitar departments, where like every wanker in LA would show up either there or at the Sunset Guitar Center and just make awful noises. So yeah, it just, I think what was really interesting is we met a lot of people there, both behind the counter as mentioned, but also as customers. Like my first real proper gig came through someone who I met as a customer, who again is still friends with both Michael and I, Michael Stephen Bray, to this day. And he made the referral, and it was a big documentary for the U.S. Air Force or whatever. But it came through somebody that I just met, and there are others as well that I met, on the other side of the counter at Guitar Center. So it was a very instrumental time.
It was like a networking place, much more than making any money, which I made zero. But it was great networking there.
Yeah,
I wouldn't be here if I hadn't made that weird decision to go work there for 6 months or however long it was.
Yeah.
This is an awkward time to go. This episode is sponsored by Sam Ash.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. I can totally feel how you were sort of exactly at the right place, right time, with the vibe there, the kinds of people there. It probably was the heyday of it in terms of if you needed to go somewhere as a music professional in LA, there weren't a lot of places you could just walk in the door and have some hope of bumping into somebody who would actually be able to answer your questions. Obviously, you both projected that you actually knew what you were talking about, whereas half the time these days you go into these kinds of places or big box retail, like Best Buy sort of thing, and you go, hey, I got a question about this, and then you see them, they get on their phone and they go, well, according to the website, and you're like, okay, so you're basically here to make sure I don't steal it. That's kind of the function. And whereas you guys really knew the subject, you knew the ins and outs, and totally. that's amazing. I love that. I had no idea this component of the story.
Yeah.
So cool. So yeah, I think it makes total sense that there was this kind of organic growth then of just actually managing to get work and say, okay, let's sort of formalize this into a partnership. Right. It seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, because it feels like what you've managed to do in the last 20 years, you said 2004. So we're essentially, in fact, I'm pretty sure by the time this is released, we can call this celebrating 20 years exactly of the existence of Ninja Tracks. It seems to me, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that you've almost maintained two parallel careers, because Ninja Tracks is a wonderful, prosperous business that has very specific things that it seems to do. But when I go and listen to the Forza stuff, Splinter Cell stuff, it's not credited as Ninja Tracks in the way that some folks who do the kind of production, like obviously a recent example is Hans Start's Bleeding Fingers, right? Which is like a music sort of collective. Now that's a little bit different because people come and go and it's like a production company. It's a little bit different than something as personal and as singularly defined as the two of you. But the point is, there's a lot of music already out in the world that's credited as by Bleeding Fingers. And I think it's noteworthy that it seems like there are things that are branded, as it were, as Ninja Tracks, and then there's things that it's your two names. And am I correct in the sort of diagnosis that it's almost like two parallel lanes of there's things that we do as us and there's things that we do as Ninja Tracks? Have I sized that up accurately?
Yeah, I think so. Mostly the Ninja Tracks name, brand, label gets put on things that are for film, TV, and video game advertising. It's really, for the past 20 years, we've been really involved in film advertising. Right. And then the video game stuff was tons. And then the video game stuff was just a very separate thing. And there were such different disciplines too. I mean, it's a nice breath to like get away from one to go back to the other and flex a different muscle, even artistically and musically.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. I just was curious if there was a conscientious, like, I think you kind of sort of said it, but it seems like Ninja Tracks as an advertising oriented brand, as it were, lets you be sort of yourselves in the more longer form. I hesitate to say more artistic, because the caliber of the work that you've done in the advertising space is so amazing that it feels very reductive to make it seem like, no, that's sort of the meat and potatoes. That's like the day job. And then we, score games to express ourselves and be touchy feely. That's super inaccurate, it would seem. Is that, do you feel that way?
It would be inaccurate to blanketly say that, because there is this really cool thing about doing sort of trailer music, and that you can write whatever you want. Doesn't mean anyone will want to license it from you or use it in their advertising campaign, but you are welcome to follow any artistic muse you want. And then sometimes that does pay off, because you'll blow someone's mind and they'll be like, oh, I've never thought of doing a trailer with this kind of music before. On the flip side, with trailers, there's a lot of expectations of formats and things like that you're pretty locked into on a higher percentage average. And then on the video games, also sometimes, if you start a video game, they're like, cool, this is it. Now we need 50 of this cake. Go make this cake 50 times again. And it's a different kind of thing, but it is nice to kind of be able to break out of one particular format, put on a different hat, and go down, explore that road.
I think there's something else worth mentioning too. It's like when we started Ninja Tracks, and throughout the years, there's been a lot of other projects. We've scored film together, as I said, documentaries, there's been a variety of different things. And one of the foundations of our approach to Ninja Tracks was to write artist-centric music. I know that's sort of a vagary, but what I will say is that the trailer music industry today is a very different animal than it was when we started. I think the musical view, and I say this in fairness, and I say this with gratitude to the industry, but I will say as an observation that the musical view is a lot more myopic today than it has been over the years. I think there was a greater breadth of music used, genres of music, things like that in prior years. And I feel like our needle's been stuck in the same groove for a long time. And it's sort of informed a lot of up and coming composers to this industry that this is the only thing you can do. This is the only way you can do it. And if you buy certain sample libraries, you are now, quote, a trailer music composer, which is as silly as saying you bought Spitfire symphonic strings, so you're a classical composer for the stage now. I mean, you may
as well say you bought blank staff paper and you're now an opera composer or something.
Exactly. So there's a little bit of, I think, a limitation that's been placed, and then therefore a stigma attached to what trailer music actually is. But back in the day, it was a lot more open. And so, unlike a lot of other companies, a lot of our contemporaries, Ninja Tracks was never a 10, 15, 20, 30 album a year outfit. Right. Michael and I would work really hard all year, and maybe we'd have the equivalent of 2 albums worth of curated, crafted content that we genuinely, absolutely cared about. And that went on for years. Years and years and years. And then, you fast forward some years and you just go, I'm really tired because me and you have to do everything all the time. And I'm getting older. We both have families. We both have children.
Yeah.
And there's, a lot of stuff going on, things coming in, other things coming in. And you get to a point where you're like, maybe it's time to change our model to mimic that of many of our colleagues and competitors. And so we opened the door to other people. And so now Ninja Tracks today, as a publisher, we represent 50, 60 composers outside of Michael and I around the world.
I don't think I realized that. That's fascinating. Does that mean that your role shifted to more of a curating of, having your ear to the ground of what you think is likely to get sync deals and that sort of thing?
Yes, there's a lot of producing. We tend to look for artists that have a unique artistic voice. I mean, there's so many people just doing the center lane of what they consider to be trailer music, which, as I said, is sort of a limited view. So we're very much interested in people who are genuine artists. Many of our people come from all sorts of backgrounds and are involved in all sorts of things. So we're looking for perspective. But it takes time. It takes time. There's a lot of curation. There's a lot of back and forth notes. And sometimes we get involved in mixing and mastering and things like that. But I think the big picture for us has been, Ninja Tracks does a lot of music for film, TV, game advertising, but we do it, with our artist hat on first and foremost. Right. We're not a high output company. It's not been our thing.
I actually remember that being when we met the first time. I remember you explaining that because I wasn't quite sure. I didn't really know what the business model was. I just saw a website with a bunch of high profile movie posters saying, here's some of the trailers we've worked on and things like that. Right. Meanwhile, I had met mostly through friends at Remote Control, like Position Music and Extreme Music and some of these others where they do seemingly just say, here, we've got 50,000 options for you. And they're all, produced pretty elaborately and at a high level. And I remember you were like, I would describe what we do as far more boutique. And I remember at the time going, I know all the words in that sentence, but I don't really know what you mean. Right. And it took me a while to ever kind of really understand. And I would think that it also feels like, especially given what you were saying a moment ago about how much the industry has changed since you first started, that it actually is very much like the way our careers work in film and TV and games, where it's your relationships in the advertising space that are so crucial as well. Because you're not just mindlessly pitching to some email address the way so many other folks are, but like you're a known quantity to these people, and that relationship is a big part of the calculation, as someone who's trusted both from a production value standpoint, but also a taste standpoint.
Yes. No, I think that's accurate.
How long did it take if you started kind of going, okay, we've got our first feet on the ground around, say, 2000, and then 2004 is sort of what looks like when you kind of officially got the ball rolling. How long was it before you felt like it started to resemble what it feels like today? There's always a curve, and it's often kind of exponential because it's just work tends to beget work. How long did it feel before you were sort of firmly planted on the ground as Ninja Tracks after 2004? Did it happen pretty quickly, or was it a grind for a while?
Well, I think the whole first year was such a strong commitment that we really had to put a lot of faith in each other, because you sit down and there's no product until you make the product. So the first year was like, cool, we're going to do this. We have nothing. We need to start writing, and it's got to be great. So it was about a year of ramping up the production and figuring out what is stylistically, what are we doing? And then artwork and all of that stuff. So that first year is just kind of going on faith, and you're sort of gliding the plane down, hoping that, at some point it catches wind and catches on again. But I don't really recall when we were started to get in regular rotation, but I think like pretty quickly after that first year, we started getting hits and quotes and building relationships pretty quickly. Because I think even then we were doing something a little different in the industry. We were bringing something a little different. So it was enough to open the door on the quality of the music and sort of a different take on what was going on.
Has there ever, actually, a couple questions. One directly off of that is, did it feel like a gamble? It's always interesting how in hindsight, when you're talking to someone that's actually made it work and you did manage to like take flight and do the thing, it always looks kind of deceptively, especially to an outside perspective, it looks deceptively inevitable. But there has to have been moments of going, was this a colossal miscalculation on our part?
Have you ever seen those memes where it's like a model and she's like, there's a voiceover like, how did you know you were going to be able to do this? And her answer is like, well, I'm totally delusional. Like sometimes it feels like that, but quite honestly, Kaveh has to give him full credit, has incredible vision on things like that, and it's a little addictive. There was a point I was coming out of pop music, and like I was so burned out on music because I would write music, and then it was at a time when you would have a Disney TV show person come and sing it, and you're like, well, that song was just ruined. It's awful. And I was working like 20 hours a day, just grinding. And it was just, I was done. I think really at the core of it is like Kaveh had sort of a Star Wars tractor beamish sort of energy of like, we can do this. And I think I was a little caught in it, even though it was like, I don't know, maybe sure. And that infectious energy of that the drive and the vision and that optimistic, like, no, I see it. That for that first year really kind of from my side helped push through that and go like, oh yeah, we can do that. And once the music started to come together and our relationship got stronger and working together and stuff, I think there was a point even before we had success that both of us were on that page of like, oh, we got this. We were maybe at that delusional page where we were like, we're going to crush the world. It's everything. Take every job. But it was going really strong before the evidence showed up, I think, in terms of that.
Right. Yeah. It's so interesting. Were you doing like film and TV odd jobs and things like that in tandem with all of this? Or was it very focused on the advertising thing to begin with? Because obviously you have branched out, over the years for sure. And we're going to get into the game stuff in a second. But like at that time, especially as you're laying the foundation, was it just this kind of potpourri of random stuff in order to keep the lights on, or what was the nature of your day to day?
So as Michael mentioned, he was doing a lot of pop and rock, sort of coming out of the late '90s into really around the time that we started Ninja Track. So there was a good 5-year period or so there for him, and for me during that time, I was doing all scoring jobs. There was a lot of documentary scores. There was some TV miniseries, as you do, Discovery Channel, Travel Channel, A&E, things like that. There was some animated shows. I did a lot of ghostwriting for a friend who was doing a lot of consistent work for. Do you remember that French production company Deke? They did
Inspector Gadget.
Sure, right.
And all those types of shows. So I was doing a lot of ghostwriting for him at the time, and then. A little bit later, a bunch of reality TV show opportunities came up. So there was a lot of that. And then some small films and things. So it was actually, quite busy. There was a lot of scoring going on at that time. And Michael was doing the other side of the coin. And after Ninja Track started, some of those types of jobs continued. So there was scoring things still coming in. The first video game project for us, which was Splinter Cell Conviction, that showed up in 2007. So in the interim, I don't remember specifically, but there's always been a stream of scoring gigs that have come along every single year. But as I mentioned, the first game opportunity didn't show up until 2007.
Yeah, that's a perfect pivot. So how did that come to be? Because obviously, much like in film and TV, how one kind of gets their first job, there are as many stories of that as there are composers. It's just always a novel situation, a novel kind of cast of characters. Where did Splinter Cell come from for you guys?
So it was a queue. Sorry, Mike. Do you remember the name of the queue? I think it was called the Cell, if I remember.
I think so. Yeah.
It was a piece of music that existed in our Ninja Tracks library that had made it in front of the marketing department at Ubisoft, and then filtered its way to one of the audio directors at the time. And they really liked it. Again, I think because, we were just writing what we thought was cool, great music in different styles. This just happened to fit a direction that they were really interested in. And they invited us to pitch. And we pitched, I think, against 5 or 6 other teams. And then there was a long wait, which was a tough, long wait, as it always is. And then they reached out and said, hey, you got the gig.
So then, out of curiosity, knowing that it was part of the Ninja Tracks catalog, were you tempted to make it a Ninja Tracks gig? I mean, I know I kind of already asked this question, but it's interesting that I didn't actually anticipate that it would be a thing like the story you just told, and it would make sense, or I could even see them wanting you to do that, because they're like, hey, we see this brand emerging that's getting a lot of work out in the world and is like known for certain kinds of things. And that's sort of part of what we're buying into. That happens sometimes. So was there any temptation to do that?
I don't think so. And I think partly because we were still doing work individually, and
sure,
we had started careers beforehand also. And it just always felt like Ninja Tracks is the trailer and advertising side of that. And then there's another side of it. And also, I maybe deep down too, I was like, no one's going to know who Michael Nielsen is if I call everything Ninja Tracks.
That's true.
It's funny.
True.
I've always thought that way as well. If only because all my favorite composers were them. That was their name. Right. It was. There were very few exceptions. Goblin and a few others that you're like, oh, that's like a moniker. Right. But by and large, yeah, it was always the person. But I've also occasionally met people. They're like, no, I kind of like that I sort of have a life that's sort of totally not accessible. Like there's sort of this thing I put out into the world and I do that work, and then it's not who right. I am necessarily. And I'm like, no, it is. This is what you get. This is there's no more else to me. I
wonder if it would be different if we had started all music in our career as Ninja Tracks.
Right.
I think, Ninja Tracks came later, and we had already done a lot
right.
as ourselves, so to speak. So I think it just was organic to keep it separate that way.
So then one very crucial and colossally important question is, going into that Splinter Cell experience, what was your general relationship with gaming? Like, were you gamers independent of that? Was there an onboarding process into the vocabulary of scoring a game? What was that first experience like?
If I may, real quick.
Yeah.
Yes, gaming. Like, especially around that time, like we had both been big fans of the Splinter Cell franchise, but the sweet home base was Halo and Mortal Kombat. A couple of others, but we would get together and it would be an all-night Halo extravaganza with rocket launchers in a small map, and just like, yeah. So we were pretty knee deep in video games at the time. None of us had kids, so it was like
right.
There was that extra time to pull that off and stuff. That's all I have to say on that. Kaveh, you could go ahead.
On that note, just to tell you how absolutely dead on Michael is. One night, the guys were over at my house, and the clock strikes 1 a.m. We're playing Halo all night. Clock strikes 1 a.m. and I hear a voice from down the hallway at my house, and it was my wife. And she's like, "I'm having a baby. We got to go to the hospital."
Everybody out.
Like, all right.
And you're like, almost done with this match. Just give us 1 minute.
1 second. We're almost there. I got 25 kills. Come on. But she's like, "We got to go." So I was like, "All right, guys, get out." And we went, and my son was born. But we were playing Halo that night.
That's why your son is named Master Chief.
Yes.
That's
what a missed opportunity, Kaveh. I didn't even think of that.
That's so funny. I'll have to share with you. I've done work over the years with this group in Australia called Tripod that is like a comedy band. And this game that came out this year called Stray Gods, they were one of my main collaborators on that. And they're
super cool.
They're
congratulations on that, by the way, bud.
Much appreciated.
And the Lego gig. You're a living legend, my friend.
Well, it's not about me, but you're very kind. But these Tripod guys, it's these three of them named Scott, Steven, and Simon. They're literally a trio comedy. Like I always say, they're sort of like Flight of the Conchords-esque, but they're capable of being quite musically sophisticated, and they sing 3-part harmonies and whatnot together as part of their shtick. But they're very funny. They're definitely a comedy band, and they've got a song that it's like one of their classics from 20 years ago that you can find on YouTube and whatnot. That's called "Gonna Make You Happy." That's basically that exact scenario where it's like this guy with his girlfriend, and it starts off with this sort of doo-wop, like, "I'm gonna treat you so right, baby," and then it takes this left turn where it's just the save points are really far apart from each other on this level. So like maybe go brush your teeth. I need just 2 minutes. It's so hysterical the way they execute this song, and it's like, it's just,
You'll find that.
I lived it. I lived the experience.
Yeah, it's very much. There's one that we did together as well when we first hooked up. Was about 10 years ago. They got commissioned by the Melbourne Symphony in Australia to make like a full evening length comedy show.
Yeah.
That was them singing plus the full symphony orchestra, and I had a relationship with one of the people there who brought me in to kind of orchestrate the show. Like they were writing original songs, but they're just as guitar and vocal demos, and they were like, orchestrate these to high hell. And one of them is literally a 7-minute epic. It's called 3 Seconds of Halo, and it is a 7-minute song describing a 3-second moment from one of their matches. And because it's
amazing.
I'll send it to you. I've got recordings of it where it's literally they're about how they're playing in Blood Gulch, and one of them is obsessed with getting the warthog, and it gets lodged in this cave. So he's having this whole drama of what he calls the hole of embarrassment in Blood Gulch. And then another guy is talking about how he keeps hitting the wrong. It's like his keys are mapped wrong on his Xbox controller, so because he keeps accidentally trying to reload, and he's just repeatedly doing the wrong thing. So there's this whole sub thread about how he's fumbling with his gun, and then one guy ends up inadvertently getting a double kill on both of them, and it was the greatest moment of his life. And this is a real story that really happened, because it's a whole bit as part of their act as a band, that their whole like road case in their rider was we have a case for our Xbox. And they do a whole song about how touring around Australia, they learned all the adapter needs of different hotels because the Halo match could not happen. And anyway, you would love it. It's so funny.
Amazing.
You know what? And it's funny, their writer with the road case, 10 years ago, Kaveh and I and Ninja Tracks, we got big enough where we decided we were going to build a studio and be able to work together. And just as the timing worked out, Kaveh had a house he moved out of as he moved into another house. We're like, let's convert this house into the full Ninja Tracks studio. And we did. It was beautiful and amazing. Every single room got an Xbox 360, and we made sure that the controllers reached through the soundproof doors and everything. We had everything wired together and never used them once. We were just so busy once we started.
Funny. I never, this is the studio. This is your Mix Magazine showcased studio, if I understand correctly.
It is. And alas, it's not ours anymore. I sold it earlier this year.
Really? I didn't know that. Does that mean
Yeah.
you've gone back to working from home and you've kind of got your spaces individually and you just sort of embraced the pandemic style, it's all Zoom calls from here on out kind of thing?
Well, I mean, Mike's in his space at home, as you can see, a very nice space in glorious 4K. Um, yeah,
It's true.
so it's kind of I think it's probably a lot of people's stories, but the pandemic changed the way we were doing things. We have one other partner in Ninja Tracks who runs administration. Basically, he runs the business, so to speak, on a day-to-day basis, and his wife works and he has smaller kids, and he can really work from anywhere. So during the pandemic, like, he just stopped coming in and was working from home. And then I think for Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, I feel like you wanted to have a second setup, and that second setup just quickly became your primary setup.
It started when I had gotten COVID in like early December at some point, and then we were all trying to be real careful. So it's like, okay, well, I'm not coming back until like it's a full green, all clear thing. And it was a month and a half, and I was like, well, I can't just not do anything. So I started setting up something, and then it was like, oh, I could actually do something at home, and it's kind of nice rolling out of bed and not having to go somewhere else to do
so
that.
I was going by myself a lot, and for me, it's a commute. It was about 20-25 minutes there, and on the way home, you know what LA is like it's 8 miles, but it'll take you 35-40 minutes to get home or something.
You could all but walk it in the same amount of time.
Right. So the simple reality too is that when we started, we were younger and we were different people, and I feel like what we came to realize is there must be a better way to use the time throughout the day, a more productive way to use the time throughout the day, because it's not all creativity all day long. You have pockets, as you well know. And so there was something about that, where the location of that property was, that just wasn't conducive to coming and going. I'd always, when I went there, I felt like I just had to stay there and like sit in my chair.
Right.
And you don't always have super productive days all the time. And so I think for a number of reasons, we decided, I think it was an incredible space and it served us so, so well. But, it was time to maybe let someone else use the space. And we did. We found someone who's, also a producer and very active on YouTube and things like that. And they're filming in the space and all sorts of things. So it worked out well. But for us, I think we just wanted to move on to whatever this new era of working is going to be. So I've been set up in a temporary space. I haven't started my build yet. I'm going to build something probably in my backyard. But, again, having children and a family and just this idea of being able to have immediate access and work when I want to work, whether it be weekends or the evenings or whatever, without having to drive half an hour to get somewhere. So that's something I'm really looking forward to. And I think Michael's been enjoying that, right? It's the accessibility.
No, it's great. I can't tell you how many times I would finish something, leave the studio, pull out, get to the street, have to turn back around because I listened, there was a click in the mix. I'm like, I'm back, coming back in again. Like, okay, print, and nope, and I'm coming back again, or I forgot to upload it, or, whatever it was. It just, I like being able to work when I want to work. And we had, like Kaveh said, we had a strong, like, show up at 9, leave at 6 sort of mentality. And it worked for a while. We were there 10 years, so it worked for a long while. But there's a point where, like, I've been here for 8 hours and I really had an hour of productivity. And I could have used this in so many other productive ways so that when I am ready to write, I am writing. And it's a strong window of productivity rather than like, must be on point from 9 to 6. Just stop working that way. I stopped working that way, at some point.
Yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm possibly on a similar trajectory, but 3 or 4 years back from where you are, because I've spent the last 17 years not working from home, and I've just moved to a new spot that's about that 20 to 25 minute distance. And I find myself just going, because I always hated the idea of working from home. I was like, I want my brain to click into a different gear that it does when you roll in and you kind of go through. It's like being an employee. It's like, it's just me here, but there's something that your brain does differently about going, you're on the clock now. And I've spent the last almost 20 years kind of riding that feeling. Yeah. But then there's occasionally moments where I go, it's not the worst thing to imagine going into the like the guest house kind of structure in the back or something along those lines. Right. So yeah, it's interesting hearing your arc. It's new information, because in my mind, I didn't realize you'd gotten rid of it. I definitely thought of it as you having this glorious, beautiful space still.
Yeah, no, I mean, we miss it. It was a great space. It really was. And the control rooms, they were designed by Jake Hoffman, the acoustician, and they sounded truly unbelievable. I mean, incredible rooms.
Well, hence the Mix Magazine write-up, I think. Yeah, I mean, it was just like clearly a very beautifully and purposefully built space. And that, honestly, that doesn't come as a shock, because I think anybody who listens to your work, one of the first things that stands out, and I mean this wholeheartedly, is that your mixes are astounding. I mean, it really is. We all listen to a lot of stuff. There's just some people where you just go, if there's anything I've learned, it's that these are mixes that are arrived at through a billion small moves. It's the only way to, I think, dial in a mix that well, because it's just so clear and so impactful. There's just a few folks out there, like John Powell, where you just go, God, that's just so well dialed in. It's just like scary. And anyway, it comes as no shock that the facility kind of mirrored that.
Well, thank you.
But because it's really noticeable.
Well, the good news there too is a lot of like the most recent stuff's all been done here at home for both of us. So that's good to hear that it wasn't wholly the space. You know what I mean?
No, but
the space is such a huge part of the whole equation.
Yeah, but it's one of those where, but if you go and find some USC student and give them your space and go, let's hear what you got, it won't sound like your mix. The tool is only so good. Likewise, if I gave you, here's 3 free plugins that, FabFilter was doing as a Black Friday promo, show us what you got, you could probably make something that sounds really good, because you actually know how to use the tools. You know what I mean? Right. And you actually can sort of push things and know how to push them. And that's just what comes with, actually really having mastery over one's craft versus simply just trying to buy your way out of it with plugins or nice rooms. It's the same as there are composers who work on, astounding, massive, high budget projects with 100-piece orchestras. And then I'll listen to as a soundtrack nerd, I imagine you're familiar with John Williams' 1970 TV movie adaptation of Jane Eyre, where there's a cue in that score that is written for guitar, viola, and alto recorder, and it sounds like $1 million.
Yep.
And you go, with 3 musicians in probably like capital A or something, this thing does circles around what I've heard other people do with all the bells and whistles thrown at, because he knows how to use the tools. It's the same thing. It's the same exact thing. So all that said, okay, that was a perfect answer to going into Splinter Cell. You were in fact gamers. Okay, check. I appreciate the thoroughly elaborate answer. What did that mean in terms of you for workflow? How did it feel stepping in? Obviously, the nature of the deliverables and all that kind of thing are pretty novel in games relative to basically everywhere else. I suppose advertising and trailers, there is a little bit of delivering a toolkit that is similar to games. So maybe that was smoother than just like people who just do TV all day or whatever. But walk me through what it was like doing it that first time relative to everything else you'd been doing.
I think one of the big parts, I'll leave space for you, Kav. Sorry about that.
No.
One of the big things with jumping into the games was the non-linearity of the music, because with Splinter Cell there was 3 levels in the core of the game. There were cutscenes and stuff, but in the core of the game there was the music and then a heightened and then another heightened, and at any time it has to be able to crossfade in between it. Yesterday I watched Austin your video of your roadmap for gods, and it's insane how like you could click like our roadmap is much simpler than something like that, but it's still you have to,
because you're a sane person.
You have to change the way you think about the sort of the whole of the music, because the beginning is the end and then end is the beginning, depending on where you're at. But I thought that was pretty fun. The limitations made some of that fun. I mean, you couldn't really modulate and change keys and stuff too much because you got to get back, and it wasn't the longest loops ever, because there was technology limitations at the time where they were trying to maximize as much data as they could, and they only had a certain amount that they could plop in. But
it's crazy how
it was fun.
In broad industry terms, like I just mentioned John Williams' Jane Eyre, that's 1970. Splinter Cell, you said you got that job 2007 or so. It's like in relative to 2023, 2007 is quite recent, but it's crazy. That's like 9 lifetimes in game industry terms where, nowadays, like I did a game a few years ago called The Pathless that had a pretty elaborate music system and a huge amount of content. And it's a big open world game. And it came out the same, it was a launch title available on day one of PS5, but it was also available that same day on iPhone. And phone. It's insane to me that technology has evolved such that a game of that complexity is capable of running on a thing you fit in your pocket. And like for most people is how they read texts while they're in traffic. Right. And whereas back then, a state-of-the-art console game is like, hey, by the way, we only have 100 megabytes for the entire audio footprint, and we can only support 4 streams at any given moment. And by the way, one of those has to be for dialogue and one of those has to be for sound effect. And it's like on an Xbox, it's crazy how, it's changed so much. So yeah, hearing you say like loops had to be relatively short. We had to, there were limitations on that kind of thing. I think a lot of folks don't appreciate, especially younger folks who are coming in where just the phone is now as powerful as the most powerful Xbox was just a few years ago. Those things that we had to deal with. It's wild. Was there anything, Kaveh, that you were gonna, before I sort of drag us elsewhere, where anything you were gonna throw in there about that first one out of the gate?
No, actually, Michael touched on what I was going to mention, which was I think the only novelty coming into the game for the first time to this sort of a game was, the 3-layered system, which doesn't take a lot to get a handle on. We can become familiar relatively quickly. But beyond that, and this is something that I find, and it's interesting because we've been asked this question in other conversations about the intersection of film, television, and game scoring, things like that. And the reality is, one is shorter, one is longer, one's episodic, this and that. But there's a lot of things that are familiar that are actually, the same process-wise, approach-wise, in all the different avenues of media. And I think in that respect, Splinter Cell was very much the same. It was scoring. There were moments that were linear. There's some looping things wasn't too hard to get a handle on. But nothing felt daunting or difficult, I think, from a technical approach perspective.
This is, I think part of that is sort of not giving yourselves credit for the fact that you obviously both had your ear very tightly to the ground technology wise. And I think anybody, especially like Michael, you talking about coming in, with a lot of background in like the pop world and song production and stuff, which is so tech, like so crucial. You have to really know your way around a mix and around your gear and whatnot, because that's like a lot of pop lives and dies by that. Of course, there's obviously the whole separate consideration of great hooks and all that kind of stuff. But I just mean the polish required is so immense in what you both sort of were coming to the table that it's not a shock that the the very tech-oriented asks of scoring a game would feel pretty low friction for you to wrap your head around. Whereas I think people that come from pretty like old school, they think very symphonically or something like that. They don't have quite as savvy of an ear to the notion of just music technology. It might be a steeper climb to really understand, because I just think it's going to be second nature to anybody that's already very fluent in those worlds. That would be my gut, because, for example, two great recent examples in the world of game would be Darren Korb doing Supergiant games like Hades and Transistor and Bastion. He was he played in bands and was a producer and from Brooklyn. And it was a very lateral move in so many ways for him. Or there was a game last year or so called The Cult of the Lamb of this Narayan Johnson composer in Australia who goes by the name Riverboy, who was like a full-on synth pop producer. And you can hear it in the writing. And when I was asking him about his experience sort of shifting into games, it resembled a lot of the similar, like, yeah, okay, there's a few eccentricities, but probably has more in common than it does different. And I was like, but yeah, if I asked, if James Horner had done a game, and it probably would have been like, oh, this is nothing like, this is all off-putting and I don't like it. So I think you walked in with a kind of unplanned strength built in. It would be my armchair psychologist diagnosis of why it felt relatively natural. Also, just being gamers, that's such a big one for me. It's a little bit of an axe to grind, I must admit. When I meet composers trying to get into games and I go, well, what have you played lately that you're into? They're like, oh, I don't know. I don't really follow games that closely. I'm like, well, setting aside the inevitable awkwardness of the meetings that you're going to have of people who live and breathe it all day making games, who are going to find themselves kind of befuddled by your lack of interest in their industry. Right. But also just learning how to score a game is going to be a bit of a mystery to you and not like motivated by a love of the industry. So, but yeah, in any case,
that plays into what we were talking about earlier, even with the trailer music industry. I think there's this notion that it's easy.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because it's short.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's like
that's so exactly backwards.
Yeah. And that's the thing. If anything, I think oftentimes, and Michael, I don't know how you feel about this, but writing without a picture makes things easier. That's just the bottom line, because it's informing what you're supposed to be doing, how you're going to do it.
Informing / dictating. It's not even like, it's not even tilting you. It's like, you will be out by here. You will shift gears at this. You will duck for this line of dialogue. Like, these are not exactly negotiable.
Right. And we don't have a lot of that when we sit down. So it's a more daunting task to sit down and write a piece of music with just a few parameters and a general paradigm in mind. Right. But with nothing to really inform you. But I think people think because the piece is, I should mention that I think there is not a lot of understanding on how a trailer is actually made, like how little involvement the composer actually has in how it's put together.
Of course, yeah.
You could write a 6-minute long piece that's long and condensed and just, long and involved and elaborate, and they'll get your stems. Yeah. And they'll break it apart and they'll cut it up and it will turn into some Frankenstein along with several other pieces of music and sound design and things like that we have no control over. But the idea that it's easy, I think, is something that we hear, certainly, with our ear to the ground in the industry and talking to people trying to get in or whatever. It's like, you just some hits and a couple of rises and a bram and a piano ping, and there you are. That's all trailer music is, which I think is really underselling what it really is. I think what people see and hear in the industry, you maybe watch 10, 15 major trailers a year, that doesn't represent all of it. So much of it flies under the radar. And in many ways, to me personally, the the composers, the artists in this industry, it's very much akin to the music industry as a whole, as far as there's just a wealth of artists that you have to go discover. Forget about the fact that they may have music being used in trailers. Forget about the trailer. There's just a lot of great artists working in this field, putting out music that you would go and discover on your favorite streaming site, in the same way that you may discover a new folk artist or pop artist or, whatever else kind of artist. And I feel like in that respect, people are really missing out, because there really is a great wealth of great music.
I so agree. I really couldn't agree more. That's actually, I've spent the last 12, 13 years advocating to my composer friends and colleagues to join the Recording Academy for that reason, because I'm like, never mind that our world now, especially with the whole video game thing, but even before that, yeah, we have kind of like our category that theoretically is sort of our lane. But I said, I've discovered blues musicians and hip hop producers and like people who do children's music and who are great musicians, because I joined the thing and my email address ended up on something somewhere, and I get a 4-year consideration email, and I'm like, I'm curious. And then I'm like, wow, this is and it's like some guitarist in Milwaukee who really did a great thing. And right. I love that. I love that discovery. And I've made friends. I've collaborated with people where you just go, I love that there's a way to kind of realize just how much is out there. And this is just one conduit out of a billion that you could, it's not representative of even what's fully out there, because it's already filtering by those within the Recording Academy, but there's still thousands and thousands of bands and artists. And so, yeah, I'm always, I'm on the same page. I think the more that we broaden our ears, just in general, there's no negative, there's no downside to that.
100%.
So how did you then make your way to the Forza franchise? Because obviously you've really made a huge impact, particularly there with a bunch of titles and a pretty wide breadth to what you've done for it. So where did that? Was it a similar? Just we got invited to pitch and 40 games later, here we are.
Yeah. What year was that, Mike? Do you remember?
Nope.
I think the pitch, it was 2015. And I think
it feels like farther back than that I saw your name attached to this.
Or 2014, actually, I lie. It was 2014.
Really shouldn't lie.
I know, I try. But they, in a very similar fashion to Splinter Cell, they had come across music from Ninja Tracks on YouTube.
Wow.
And they had worked with a composer or a pair of composers on, I think, 2 or 3 previous titles. Mike, do you remember at the time? But anyway, at least a couple. And they wanted to change gears musically. And they had heard some of this music, and they contacted us, saying, hey, this sounds a lot like what we're hoping to do. But, you have to go through the pitch process, which again, we did. And I think they hit us up after a while and said, okay, we're down to 5, and now we're down to 3. And, finally, however many months later, they said, okay, you got the job. And then we were given about, I think, an 8-month schedule, and there was a lot of music, about 2.5 hours of score in 8 months. And the game came out in 2015. So it was probably about somewhere between a year and a half between meeting them and getting the game out.
8 months is definitely on the shorter side for most games, where it's often a year or 2 or 3 is fairly common.
Right.
This past Forza Motorsport release, we're going on about 3 years, I want to say.
Yeah. We started, I think, spring of 2020 during the pandemic. And then, we just, obviously the game just came out in October, but it's worth mentioning that they had been in development for 6 years. So we came in at the halfway mark to help them out.
Wow, really? I didn't know about that. That's crazy. That is a really long time for a game. That, like, usually once a franchise, the whole point of a franchise is you develop something akin to a well-oiled machine, right? You know, this is why it's cheaper for Ubisoft to make another Assassin's Creed game than it is to build an entirely new IP, because there's earned knowledge that you can leverage, and people that get really good at certain types of animations and blah 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 that you can, you know, apply to it. And as long as there's a popularity there, it makes a really good amount of sense. So I'm astounded to hear that it took that amount of time. I didn't realize.
Well, it was a big change of direction for the format of the game. I mean, at its core, it's still a racing game, but it went from being something like a Madden title where you're getting that annual release.
Right.
And of course there's Forza Horizon 2, which is sort of the brother or sister game to Forza Motorsport.
Right.
So they were flip-flopping annually there. So that bought them a little time, and then they could do some like Lego stuff in between there. But it went from being, hey, we're going to release Forza Motorsport every 2 years to it's going to come out, it'll be Forza Motorsport, and that's it forever. And then we'll do in-app purchases and updates seasonally and that kind of thing. So there was a lot of sort of change in philosophy around the game. I'm not really privy to much in that, but I mean, just looking inwards, like that was a big change. That could have accounted for a lot of it.
Right.
I think there were some mechanical things under the hood as well, because I feel like Forza Horizon from Playground Games had pushed the bar quite intensely. I mean, Forza Horizon 5, I would argue, is one of the most beautiful games out. It's a couple of years old now. It's absolutely astonishing to look at and play, and the frame rate, the whole thing. It's just unbelievable. So I think for them too, they were going really back to basics and revamping the game from the ground up. And then, you know, I think there was some decision making along the way where they're like, well, maybe not this, maybe not that. And they, you know, just kept kicking the can further down the road. And it just took I think it took longer than they expected. But, you know, nonetheless, it was a ground up rebuild.
Was there anything that evolved about your approach musically over those, or especially with the latest one? Was there something that like kind of was torn down and built from the ground up, or did it feel like you were iterating in the same way that scoring a sequel, for example, one conscientiously doesn't reinvent the wheel? You know, you kind of want it to feel like a continuation of on some level. What was sort of your relationship with the ongoingness of it that you've had?
Mike?
Yeah, I think, well, each of the games, there was a pretty significant exploration period where you're trying to establish what it is. I think maybe the first one that we did was the most where they asked us just to bring what you do to it. And because they already were like, that's the sound we want.
Right.
And then the follow-up to that was a total left turn where they said, like, we want it to be, you know, like Black Keys, White Stripes, indie rock, Lana Del Rey thing. And we kept going like, cool, with score, right? And then, so we turned stuff in and they're like, no, just Black Keys, White Stripes, Lana Del Rey, Fantagram. Cool. With strings and synths, you know, in there, right? No. So that turned into, you know, way left field from where we came from. And then we go to this next one and they turned right again and went the other direction. And there was a lot of finding it. And it was an ongoing finding it because there was a lot of sort of like esports feeling, that big fanfare stuff. And then it went big and then it went small. And as they were developing, we were kind of following and developing as well. And just trying to find the right color for the whole thing, which was nice because we were involved for such a long time.
Right.
You know, it does hurt sometimes when you're like, I love this piece of music, and I'm pretty sure it just went in the trash can.
Yeah. Know that feeling all too well. Yeah, it's always fascinating because you never know when you hear something, especially I didn't even realize how long the sort of gestation had been, but it's truly impossible from the outside to get a sense of, did this go through a lot, or was it just one of those shoot from the hip and they went, we love it, great, next? and
Right.
how much kind of even philosophical reorienting was required to really feel like it was known and understood. It feels all very natural. Although I will say something that I thought was cool. I haven't played the new like Motorsport, but one thing that I thought was cool when I was just listening to the music when it first came out was particularly that main theme doesn't feel like that kind of big fanfare esport. It's like this emotional and almost delicate kind of piece, which I live for, those kind of unexpected juxtapositions. I always loved. You remember the Italian Job, the remake, obviously that opening titles that John Powell did, where it always feels like it's a car getting ready to go, but it never takes off. It's the whole thing is kind of like a boiling lid that's kind of shaking in place and never pops. And I just thought, what a cool way to, especially in this, era of John Woo action movies and stuff, you're expecting some big statement and it never goes there.
Right.
Sort of teases you the whole time. And this had a similar quality, although it's more explicitly kind of emotional in a way. And it's fascinating hearing that you were kind of exploring that for a while before maybe landing on that, if I'm hearing you right.
So when we came on with Forza 6 back in 2014, 2015, they wanted something thematic. It's something that the franchise really hadn't had. And so when you listen to the album or play the game, there is a central theme that repeats here and there throughout the score. It's the first track on the album. And we're very fond of it. And I think, with Forza 7, when we went all rock, there's nothing we could do really. But when we came back, I think, the idea was, hey, we've got this theme, let's now update it. Let's bring it into this new score and reuse it. And that was the conversation early on in 2020. But quickly they rejected the idea and said, look, this is going to be Forza for the next decade. So we need something that's going to represent the game for the next decade,
right,
not for the previous decade. And so they wanted something entirely new. I think in writing that, there's a texture, a quality that we tried to capture in Forza 6 as well, that we have in this one, the new one. And I feel like there is an elegance when you think of car design, when you think of cars, and the aesthetic, the lines, in the engineering, the technology. There's almost a sensuality in the lines. And if you look at it from that perspective, and you don't just look at it as a hunk of metal that, it's got wheels and it goes fast on a track, but if you look at it, with a different set of eyes, I think the music is meant to convey those feelings, that perspective on cars and the automotive landscape and motorsport. And I think that's what dictated the sound of the new theme.
It's funny that I didn't clock that, but it's so obvious now that you say it. I love that thinking. I'll never forget in 2007, I think, I was in Germany and I saw for the first time ever the Audi R8. They were pretty new, and there was one just parked on a street. And I rushed up. I'm not a big car guy. I'm not like an expert. I don't mean to make it sound like I am, but I just saw this thing, and I was like, "That's a drivable sculpture." And I walked up to it. And I was taking all these photos of it, going, "This is so beautiful. This is so elegant," and everything you were just saying. It had that. It wasn't machismo horsepower, though it has that. It was like, this is beautiful. This is like if you ask a sculptor to sculpt a horse, and there's this movement that feels frozen in time. That's what a car, when parked on a sidewalk, can be at its most sort of elegant. And that's a lovely inroad. I love that idea of there's a reverence and a beauty to it. Look, you guys have been very generous with your time. I don't want to steal your whole afternoon, but one last thing I wanted to ask about that was kind of where we sort of started, but I'd love to just dig into it for just another minute if you can, which is the actual literal workflow between the two of you, because it's noteworthy. that everything is very much the partnership. Like if I go on Spotify and I look up Forza or Splinter Cell, whatever, it's both your names on everything. And obviously at some point there is a division of labor that happens, but you already made it clear that there's a certain amount of sharing ideas and listening to each other's sort of work and things fluidly moving. But how do you make it work? Your analogy to a marriage is so apt because there can't be ego in a partnership between the two contributors. Obviously, like it would never function if one person started to feel like I'm kind of the boss and you sort of work for me. Like it would never come off, or at least I would be astounded if it did. Right. How do you sort of internally delegate? Is it different? Is every project kind of take shape differently? How does this mystifies me because I've so little experience with this kind of thing. And I'm just curious how you've managed that, because clearly it works. So I'm just fascinated.
Thank you.
I think some of it, the delegation happens. I think the first tier is who will draw the most joy and fun out of this particular thing that needs to get done. So if it's something that it's just like, I've been dreaming of this. This is for me. It's like, great, go enjoy it. Like have at it. And the next tier down is probably a little more like, for instance, the Forza theme. If you look at Forza 6 and Forza Motorsport, those are Kaveh's babies. Those are Kaveh's brainchilds, 100%. I just get to sign my name to it, which is a great benefit of being his partner. And they are so much him, though. I mean, if you look behind him, that's what his house looks like all the time. It's like, it's clean and serene and like it's beautiful. And like he has that passion for cars where it's like it matters. Like I'm a lot dirtier. So it's just that would come through the music. It wouldn't land in the same way. I know that. So like I could do something that I would enjoy, but like in some ways, like I wanted to hear what he could do. I loved the theme he created for Forza 6. It seemed right at home for the next one. So like in that case, it's like, go for it. And he's been equally generous backwards to me on projects that I've been excited about.
But to what you said, Austin, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like ego has not been part of our friendship and our partnership, our musical partnership, I think ever. We come to the table with a great deal of love and respect for each other. Michael is genuinely one of the most all-around talented people I've ever known. The fact that he's been a partner and brother in arms is just entirely my privilege these 20, 25 years. He's just so good at everything he does. And it's been a university level course for me ongoing for the past 25 years. I've just learned so much. And the fact that we come from different backgrounds, I think has made this, much more exciting. Simply because we come at the same things with different perspectives. When we have to do something orchestral, Mike's take on it is entirely different from mine. When we did Forza 7, I mean, that was Michael 100%. Because he comes from that rock background. He grew up on that music. I don't know anything, nothing. So I was a deer in headlights, like shitting my pants. What are we going to do? I'm going to ruin this project. And so,
but you also wrote some of the coolest tracks. It was a great. You came at it from such a different place. It was really cool.
Well, thank you. I mean, you're very generous as always. But the reality is that like he held my hand through that. And it was amazing because we hired some of the greatest rock musicians walking the earth. We got some of the best mixing engineers in rock music, some of the best mastering engineers. So what an incredible experience to come in as a total novice and learn from Michael, learn how that works, and then be exposed to these unbelievable people in that world. So it's been a lot of that. It's been a lot of learning, and there's been a lot of rubbing off on one another and that sort of thing. And it's all founded and based on, I think, a mutual respect and lack of ego. So, and that continues to be the case to today. We really are trying our best to grow every year. We're constantly on top of new technology and libraries and plugins and art outboard, because it's genuinely interesting and fascinating. I feel like there's always something to learn, and listening to great new music from, people, wonderful composers like yourself and many others, and just keep growing every year and, keep this gift of partnership that we've been given.
I have no possible better way, I think, to wrap this up than that lovely, very optimistic take on your partnership. It's very cool. I think everything you said just is fascinating, enlightening, and so yeah, I really appreciate both of you taking the time to share some thoughts.
Thanks, man. Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
us.
Austin. Super cool
fun.
hanging with you.
Totally. Really enjoyed it.